This is Join Us in France, Episode 4. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise. And we welcome you to the Join Us in France podcast, the show where we share the best of France.
Elise is a professional tour guide and art historian, and this is the podcast where we help you prepare your trip to France and share with you everything you need to know to have a great time in France. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the stunning Cathedral of Notre de Paris and its history. On joinusinfrance.com, you will find our show notes, and we hope you'll also visit to say hello, and we have some extras for you there. And now, a little music to get us in the mood, and then we'll jump right into it.
Hi, Annie.
Hi, Elise. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm just fine, thank you. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
What is Notre Dame Cathedral? Why do we want to see it?
Why do you want to see it? Well, let's start from a different point of view. Did you know that, in fact, Notre Dame Cathedral is the most visited monument in all of Paris?
Really?
Yep. It's more visited than the Eiffel Tower, than the Louvre
hard
Museum.
To believe.
Yep. 20 million people every year.
20 million people.
20 million people every year.
Wow.
It is one of the oldest medieval structures left in Paris. Mm-hmm. It is grandiose in its size. It's absolutely fabulous. And it has a long, wonderfully interesting history. So there are some reasons to talk about Notre Dame Cathedral.
Yeah. So where is it?
Notre Dame Cathedral.
Let's start there. Let's find it.
Let's do this. Let's talk about where it is and a little bit of the basic history. Notre Dame Cathedral is on Ile de la Cité. For those people who have listened to our podcast.
Yeah, we did a previous podcast about that.
Right, about Ile de la Cité. They know that. Otherwise, what you need to know is that Ile de la Cité is this tiny little island in the middle of the Seine River, which is the river that cuts Paris in two and is where the city basically began. Right. And Notre Dame Cathedral is dead on the island, on the eastern half of it, because it's an island that's kind of shaped like a very long eye. And the cathedral itself actually takes up the space on the eastern side. The river runs east-west, so there you are. Okay. And being a cathedral means that it is, in fact, the head church of the city of Paris. Now, just to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about, France is a Roman Catholic country. So we are talking about churches that are Roman Catholic churches, which means they have a hierarchy. And you have neighborhood churches, and then there are different categories of churches. And the top church of a city or a region is always the cathedral.
Right.
That's where the bishop or the archbishop is.
Right.
That's where he stays. That's where he lives. That's where he does the services from. So Notre Dame is the cathedral of Paris. And it has been forever. However, at the very beginning, and the very beginning is a really long time ago, the very beginning is in approximately the 400s or the 500s. Apparently, nobody's exactly sure. There was another cathedral there on the same spot, but it was not called Notre Dame. It was called Saint-Étienne.
Okay.
That was the first big church that was classified as a cathedral. And as happened in a lot of places in France and in most of Western Europe, after a number of centuries, and we're talking centuries here, the church became too small and it started to be run down.
Okay.
And so what people did was they decided it was time to finance the building of a new church.
Okay.
And since they were going to make it new, they decided to make it bigger. That's what people do, right?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to you. So there was an archbishop, and he was a very important man. And his name was actually Abbé Suguet, which looks like sugar if you look at the word written down. And he was in charge of the church in Paris, and he was the best buddy of the French king, and he was his actual confessor and priest at the same time. So this was a man who had a lot of power. He also had a lot of money. He was a nobleman, and he had access to a lot of money. And so he decided that if they were going to rebuild and make a new church, first of all, he decided to change the name of it and dedicate it to the Virgin Mary, which is why it's called Notre Dame, which of course means Our Lady.
Right.
And that was a very fashionable thing to do at the time that the church was built. So there were lots and lots of churches built called Notre Dame.
That's right. They're all over France.
They're all over France. And believe it or not, most of them were really from the same time period because it was the fashion to do.
Yeah.
Okay. So he got a lot of incredibly wonderful stonemasons and workers together, and they started the building of this new church. They razed the old one, so there's nothing left of it. And they began the work on this incredible building that is enormous. It is an absolutely humongous building as a church. And they decided to build it in a new style, which is a style of church that wound up going all over Paris and then all over northern France. And that is this new style called Gothic.
Okay.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit later about what that actually means to talk about a Gothic style church.
So why is it so important to go visit Notre Dame? Why is it visited by so many people? What makes it so special?
Okay, that's actually a fair question to ask. Aside from the fact that it's a structure that is incredibly old, it is a church that was started 850 years ago.
Yeah.
That's a long time ago.
Yes.
It's a church that, in fact, was extremely innovative. And a lot of things were built on it or as part of it for the very first time. And then afterwards were used in other places. So it was basically a landmark from the beginning because it used and did things that had not been done before. So historically, it's really, really important. So it's very old. It's very big. It's a church that was very innovative. And last but really not least, it's incredibly beautiful.
That is true.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And it is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the things you must see when you go to Paris. Now, I mean that. In other words, so whether you're in Paris for one day or for a week or more, I think you really must see Notre Dame.
Yeah.
With the difference being, of course, that if you're only in Paris for a day or two and you don't have a lot of time, then basically probably the best thing to do is make sure you see it from the outside. If you have more time, it's really great to do a full, detailed visit, both outside and inside.
Right, right. So why did they build such big churches back then?
Well, again, it's a really interesting question because it's a fascinating story. There are two reasons why. One was for the very simple reason that the churches were built to impress people. They still impress people, of course,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But imagine that this is a church that was started in the year 1163. That's a long, long time ago.
Yes.
I mean, the 1100s is like, what were they doing in the 1100s? Well,
We can't even imagine what life must have been like then. I mean, I can't. I don't know. Maybe I don't have enough of an imagination, I guess.
well, strangely enough, let's try and think of it this way. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have hydraulics. They certainly didn't have electronics and digital things like
Anything.
that.
Yeah.
But every occupation that you can imagine that was not basically based on anything high tech existed already at that time. So
Yeah.
you have your butcher, your baker, you have your builder, you have people who were scribes who did the writing because they hadn't yet invented the printing press. You have lots of
Right.
different activities.
Right.
Life was busy, right?
Yeah, but then the architect, the person drawing the thing, I mean, can you imagine the work involved? I mean, today it's just a massive file on a computer and people can cooperate but not back then.
No, and so the story of Notre Dame, like the story of many of the cathedrals, is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Because number one, we know who paid for the church. We know whose idea it was to build. We don't know the people who designed it. We just don't know. It was a time when work was basically anonymous. You have stonemasons who were also sculptors. They were both at the same time. And they worked under the direction of the person who was in charge of the building. In this case, it was an archbishop. And that person basically would be able to tell them, I want you to build this a little bit higher here. I want to add a little bit this there. But we don't know the actual people. What, of course, we do know is that it probably was hundreds. And since we're talking about a time when everything was done by hand, even though there was scaffolding, there were pulleys and levers and basically all the tools you can imagine for cutting and shaping things. Everything took a long time.
Yeah.
So the first stone was placed in the year 1163. The entire church was finished and functioning on the outside, at least, in 1250. That means that it was less than 100 years. That's actually a fairly short amount of time considering how big the church was.
Yeah.
Now, to go back to your question of why such a big church, number one, it's because the church was very rich and powerful. The cathedral was considered to be a place that was a sanctuary. So when things got bad outside, if it was dangerous because of invasion, if there were plagues, if there were any major problems, people would go and seek sanctuary inside the church. And of course, you had local churches, but the cathedral is the big one.
Yeah.
And it is next to where the king's palace was. So it's very important that the church be as impressive in a sense as the palace itself was too. And it's also part of the history of Europe at the time that many people, of course, were really what we would consider today to be quite poor, and they lived in small, half-timbered houses with maybe grass roofs, and very rich people may have lived in buildings that were made out of stone and were a little bit more solid.
Yeah.
But life was fairly precarious. I don't think the life expectancy of most people probably never went much over 50.
Right. So the 100 years that it took to build this cathedral means that probably a lot of the people who started it were dead. Never saw it.
Every single one of them.
Yeah. Okay.
Every single one of them. Even the people who ordered the building of the church, and even the kings, by the time it was finished, it was either the children or the grandchildren.
Wow.
But there was a different sense of time anyway. And the other thing is, and this is really important to understand because there are so many of these enormous churches, not just in France really, but all over Europe, is that time had a different meaning. And people didn't build things to be done in 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. Things were built for eternity.
Yeah.
And huge churches like these were built to last, in a sense, forever, whatever that means.
And they probably will. I mean...
Well, it's done so far pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's had some reworking done, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But obviously...
Well, any building, you have to do maintenance.
You have to do maintenance. But, things that were built in those days, especially the major important buildings, which would be palaces and churches, they certainly were built in a way that makes them last a lot longer than most of what we built today.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and the other thing is that Paris, in the 1100s, was, believe it or not, the biggest city in Western Europe.
Ah.
Now, what does that mean? Well, they think, that is historians and ethnologists and anthropologists and all those other kinds of people, believe that there were approximately 50,000 people living in Paris in the 1100s, which... since the fall of the Roman Empire, made it a fairly big city.
Yeah, that's a lot of people.
Well, it's a lot of people.
For the Middle Ages,
Middle Ages. Let's put it that way. For the Middle Ages, there was a time when things had kind of like fallen apart and they were coming back together. And that was the other thing. That's why Notre Dame and everything that happened afterwards is so interesting because, believe it or not, the 1100s was a really good century. And what does that mean? It means that basically wars had stopped that had been going on for a very long time. Pretty much everywhere in Europe. Mm-hmm. There was a growth in population everywhere. There were good crops for many years in a row. And so there was a huge increase in population. There was an increase in economic activity. There was money. And there was the rise of a fairly important middle class. It was really the beginning of all of this. It sounds like it's insane. It's 1,000 years ago. But in fact, it was really a very prosperous time. So there was impetus for lots of building.
Yeah.
Lots of building of palaces, castles, and of big churches. So this is really what happened. So here we are. So we start building Notre Dame in 1163. By the year 1220, pretty much, just about 60 years later, almost all of the new structure was finished, and it was officially considered to be finished in 1250. And that's, except for some details on the inside of the church, basically we could say that it was functioning and everything was fine by that year. So all of the work, all the magnificent sculptural work, all the detail, all the structure that you can still see when you go to Paris was there by the year 1250.
Wow. That must have been really impressive to visitors. You ride your horse into a place and you see this massive construction when you've never seen anything that big.
Well, not only that, but now when you go to the church, and it'll be something we'll talk a little bit more in detail about in the second podcast about Notre Dame. But of course, there's this big open space in front of the church. But it's hard to believe when these churches were built, and I'm not talking, there's Notre Dame, there's Chartres, which is, of course, a little bit outside of Paris, and all these other major, very big cathedrals, even the ones, of course, in other countries. When they were built on a space that was very closed in, and so all these tiny little houses where people lived were right next door, and it's even more impressive when you see this building that is like hundreds of feet tall, surging up out of the middle of all this tiny little stuff. If you could fly over it now and use one of our satellites or do Google Map or something like that, it would really be incredible to see. It's the idea was to impress people and to give them this place that held them in awe, and that it worked.
Yeah.
It really worked for a very long time.
But
now,
it still works today, and we're hard to please. We've seen a lot of things as modern people, and still you walk in there and you're like, wow.
Right. And
or you walk by, you walk towards it, and you're just amazed.
It was literally meant to amaze. It was meant to be brilliant in the beautiful sense of the term in the eyes of people who beheld it. And it was also a place for pilgrims to come to. There were lots of different pilgrim routes. And so it was a place that was the sense of sanctuary because it was beautiful. It was a place where if you go inside, you're supposed to be entering into a space that helps you imagine what it's like to go to heaven. So let's make this as beautiful and incredible as possible, because we're trying to convince people that this is what they need to do, is come to church, do their prayers, and be good people in whatever the church's rules are of being a good person.
Yes.
Because this is basically what is in store for you if you are a good person and you want to go up to heaven.
That sounds pretty good.
Sounds pretty good to me too.
Yeah. Now, I've heard all my life about Gothic cathedrals, but I don't really know what it means. What where did that word come from? I'm assuming it's not teenagers dressed in black with funky piercings and white face, sort of?
No, actually, it's not. It's a really great question. Although I have to say that in spite of what being a goth is these days, if you're, a teenager and all of that, one of the things that you could say is similar between that and the sense of the term Gothic is this. The word was actually first used during the Renaissance, and the Renaissance is a time period, basically we're talking about the 1400s. So here we have a church that was started in the 1100s, was basically finished at the end of the 1200s. By the 1400s, it's a couple of hundred years later, and we are talking about Renaissance people in Italy. And of course, the Italians then, just like now, are very stylish, and they believe that their idea of aesthetic and beauty is the basic idea of what it should be.
Indeed.
And so we have a whole group of historians and artists in that time who were able to travel and notice this style of architecture, which was pretty much everywhere by that time. And most of them didn't like it. they didn't like it. They thought it was too much. It was just a little bit too much of everything. Oh, it was like overly crowded with sculpture and too many points and too many towers and too many this and too many that.
Well, yeah, that it is, yeah.
So, in a pejorative sense, they called it Gotica.
Okay.
And why did they call it Gotica? Well, it has to do with the early Middle Ages. Believe it or not, the fall of the Roman Empire, there were lots of invasions of really weird barbarian groups of people, basically going all across Europe. They sacked Rome. They went as far as France. They went up even as far as England. And one of the groups was the Goths, who came from what is now really southern Sweden.
Okay, yes.
And they were a particularly savage group of people. Now, it happens that they were actually already Christian. They had already converted to Christianity. We're talking the 400s, 500s. Yeah. But they were really a rugged kind of group of people, And
unlike the Swedes today, I mean,
today
they bring us IKEA.
They bring us IKEA, but they're tall, right? Well, can you imagine in those days? I mean, here they are sacking Rome. Rome, which was the epitome of sophistication and everything, and here they come through these barbarians, which they weren't really barbarians. They just had a different kind of civilization.
Yeah.
But what happened was that in basically Italy, which of course at that time was not really Italy, but what we would consider to be Italy today, anything that was barbaric was somehow associated with the Goths.
I see.
Which is why I say, these young people dressed in black, hey, it's not that far away in a sense, So when in the Renaissance, which was the time of going back to a certain refinement and with this new prosperity and everything, they wanted to talk disparagingly about this style of architecture that they were against, and they were into trying a new style, which was totally different, and we'll have to deal with that some other time. Mm-hmm. They went, hey, I don't want to do anything like that Gothica stuff, I mean, so it became Gothic, and the word stuck. And it became used, it was used in France later on, and it was used in England also. And it basically, it was a word that was forgotten for a long time, and it resurged, believe it or not, in the 1800s. And the reason why is because in the 1800s, when lots of buildings and lots of churches and palaces from this period of time in the Middle Ages were starting to fall apart and fall down, there was a new aesthetic. It wasn't the Roman aesthetic. It wasn't the Renaissance one. It was this new sense of what's clean and stylish and how things should look. And that was in the 1800s. And it was very different. And they also hated Gothic style. And the word had fallen into disuse, and it was brought up again by some art historians and some people who were going around saying, we've got to get rid of this stuff. It's really hideously ugly. I mean, really, it's got to go, And luckily for us today, there were 2 or 3 people who were very important and who were fairly influential who went, wait, no. There is real value in this architecture. There's real value in what it looks like. And part of its value is not so much whether you think it's pretty or not. It's that it tells about the history. And it talks to us about the past. And believe it or not, one of those people, and now we're going to get back to Notre Dame itself, that was really influential in saving the building, because they were actually thinking at the beginning of the 1800s of tearing down Notre Dame Cathedral.
What?
Oh, yeah.
They were crazy.
It's documented, So along comes a very famous writer named Victor Hugo.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, we've all heard of him, right? We haven't written, I don't think anybody's really read Victor Hugo in a long time, but, hey, we've all seen Les Mis, right?
Yeah.
So, Victor Hugo was really very, very, very influential, and he was a very interesting man, and he was very famous during his lifetime, and he found out that there was talk of destroying Notre Dame Cathedral.
Wow.
And because he was very much interested in the history of Paris, and that was one of the things he wrote a lot about, and he was very much a Republican, which meant that he was interested in the social history of everything. So the church for him, it was not because he was a religious person, because he wasn't, It was because he understood that Notre Dame Cathedral was something that had witnessed centuries and centuries of history that the country had lived through, and therefore was really an important monument.
Of course.
So he wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons he wrote the book was to make sure that people would read it, because when Victor Hugo wrote something, and it was written often in chapters that were published every week,
Yes.
everybody read what he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And when they read about the church, and then when the word got out that there was talk of destroying it, there was such a huge popular movement to save the church that it was saved.
Wow.
So he was really, really one of the people responsible for the saving of the church. And that is why we now have the magnificent Cathedral of Notre Dame. So, just to make sure we understand what we're talking about, what is Gothic style? Well, I'm going to give a rather simplified explanation, but this is stuff to keep in mind because it's basically true of every Gothic piece of architecture, whether it's a church or actually even civil architecture, but especially a church because there are so many of them. Mm-hmm. So what makes something Gothic? Well, the very, very first thing is that it's very vertical.
Okay.
It's fairly high. Mm-hmm. It's either fairly high or it's really very, very high, very tall. And it has many, many very tall vertical windows.
Yes.
That come to a point on top.
Yes.
Which is called a broken arch.
Okay.
And some of them at the end of the Gothic period actually have this kind of like almost flowery form to the broken arch part that came at the very end because it was a kind of evolution in the style. Mm-hmm. But they always have long, tall windows. And the windows are filled with stained glass.
Yes.
And the stained glass is rich saturated color in millions and millions of tiny little pieces that create images that basically tell stories.
That's cool.
And this is the very beginning of the kinds of windows that they have in Gothic architecture. And later on, the style of the windows changed, but the importance is the pointed arch, the tall windows, the verticality of the structure. And then the other element that really makes it Gothic architecture is lots and lots and lots of sculpture. Oh. Sculpture on the outside of the church, sculpture on the inside of the church, full volume sculpture and relief sculpture as well. Lots and lots of detail and lots of work everywhere. Yes. These are not simple structures. These are very complex structures. Yes. And Gothic architecture took hold and basically was the major style of architecture, even though it evolved in certain ways for, let's say, I would say almost 200 years.
Wow.
And Notre Dame is incredible because it was one of the very first to do certain things in relation to this style of architecture. And it was so influential that it was the inspiration for churches just about everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's definitely an inspiration to the visitors. Well, Elise, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off because we've been talking a while already. And so we'll just resume our next podcast and we'll just pick up where we left off and you can tell us the rest of the story. How about that?
That sounds very good to me. We've just basically done some background and some history. Our next podcast will be really describing in detail what there is to see at Notre Dame.
Very good. Well, thank you, Elise, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much, Annie. See you soon.
Okay. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
This is Annie saying goodbye. I hope you have enjoyed the program. I invite you to go to joinusinfrance.com to tell us what you like about the program, the places you'd like us to tell you about, and what you love about Paris yourself. Thank you so much for the feedback we've already received, for the iTunes reviews. It really helps us greatly as we grow an audience for this new podcast. Thank you, Rémi, for the music, and I look forward to talking to you all next week. Au revoir.